The Vanishing Village. Have you ever heard of a place that exists only in whispers? A town that no longer appears on any map? A village that slips away like smoke whenever someone tries to find it? It sounds like the stuff of ghost stories, doesn't it? But there are some who will swear it's real. Real and dangerous. There are places in the world that time seems to forget, where the very fabric of reality begins to unravel. The Vanishing Village is one such place. It's a village so lost, it's as if it never existed at all. But those who seek it, those few who manage to stumble across it, are never quite the same again. Some never return at all, while others bring something back with them, something that should never have crossed the threshold. The strange thing about this village is not its disappearance. It's the way it seems to appear, only when it's least expected. It calls to the desperate, the curious, and the brave. The ones who search for it, unknowingly, are drawn into a terrifying web of occult forces and dark secrets with no way out. What if I told you that there are those who have ventured into the heart of the Vanishing Village and returned with eyes that have seen the unimaginable, and that the secrets they now carry with them may be more horrifying than the village itself? The truth about the Vanishing Village is far worse than you could ever imagine, because it isn't just the village that vanishes, it's the people too. Tonight, we will peel back the layers of this terrifying legend and uncover the truth that has eluded us for centuries. But be warned, some things are better left untouched, and some places best left unseen. Long before the village's strange disappearances began, whispers of its existence lingered in the most unsettling corners of ancient texts. The first known reference to the Vanishing Village appears in a centuries-old manuscript, passed from one terrified hand to the next, each account more frantic than the last. Some call it a curse, others speak of it as an ancient pact with forgotten gods. But one thing is certain: something malevolent was set into motion long before modern civilization even thought to explore its dark corners. The tale begins in a remote, forgotten part of the world, where civilization had only dared to spread its tendrils after centuries of isolation. Travelers, adventurers of their time, came upon the village in the early 1800s. Strangers, lost in the mists of a remote mountain pass, reported the village's eerie silence as they stumbled upon it, only to find it completely untouched by time. The houses appeared almost too perfect, their shutters still, the roofs untouched by the weight of years. But there was something unsettling in the air, a palpable tension, as though the village itself was holding its breath. One particular explorer, a man by the name of Theodore Barlow, would be the last to leave. He arrived in the dead of winter, searching for treasure but finding only terror. After several days in the village, Theodore would write in his journal that the inhabitants, those few he saw, were strange, hollow-eyed figures who never spoke, only watched. One morning, the village was gone. The same homes, the same streets, all vanished without a trace, as though they had been wiped from existence. The surrounding forest was untouched, and the path leading to the village was no longer there. What was worse than the disappearance of the village was the chilling discovery that followed. Theodore Barlow's journal, left behind in his haste to flee, was found months later, stained with something darker than ink: blood. In his final entries, he scribbled something that would forever haunt those who dared read it. The village does not disappear, it devours. And now, I am part of it. This first encounter set off a ripple of fearful speculation, but what came next would confirm that the Vanishing Village was not just a tale. This was something otherworldly. Over the years, more and more people, lost travelers, and even whole expeditions, came upon the village, only to vanish in ways so bizarre, so inexplicable, they defy logic. Those few who survived spoke in broken whispers of things they saw, of shapes that weren't human, of things that could not be unseen. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the village would be gone again, leaving only those who had been touched by its horrors to carry its curse. Local legends tell of a pact made centuries ago, of a deal with dark, forgotten gods. It's said the village exists as a place of punishment for those who trespass, a land suspended between worlds, where time has no meaning, and no one can escape. But there is no certainty. All that remains is the folklore, the strange, conflicting stories handed down through generations, like a disease no one can cure. Some say that the village has a mind of its own, that it feeds on the living, and then, when it has had its fill, it vanishes, leaving behind only those unlucky enough to have discovered its secret. Others say the village is a riddle, one that, if solved, will grant unimaginable power. But the village doesn't give, it takes. And if you're foolish enough to go searching for it, it will take everything. It was a crisp autumn evening when a group of adventurers, each seeking answers to the village's eerie reputation, found themselves unknowingly walking the path that would lead them to the vanishing village. They had come from different walks of life. An amateur historian named Edward, a seasoned tracker called Lena, a photographer with a penchant for the strange, Nathan, and a local guide, Thomas, who had heard the village's whispers in the wind his entire life, but had never dared approach it. Together, they sought the village, driven by curiosity, ambition, and a shared hunger for the unknown. None of them could know that the village was already waiting for them, watching from the shadows. The journey began innocently enough. The dense trees of the surrounding forest gave way to a narrow path, overgrown with thorns and old, cracked stones. The air was thick with mist, the kind that clung to the skin and made every sound feel muffled. They trekked for hours, their footsteps soft against the damp earth. "It feels off," Lena muttered, glancing over her shoulder, a shadow passing behind her. But when she turned, the forest was still. Just the isolation. Thomas said, his voice unsteady, "We're out here far from civilization. It's normal to feel uneasy." Yet even he could not shake the weight in the air. As nightfall descended, an unsettling quiet wrapped around them. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping insects, rustling leaves, the occasional call of distant animals, had vanished. The only sound now was their breath and the soft crunch of dead leaves underfoot. Then they saw it. The village, sitting silently on the edge of a clearing, was not what any of them had expected. There were no welcoming lights, no sound of life. The homes were dark and still, like forgotten relics frozen in time. The only movement came from the mist that seemed to swirl around the village, as if it were alive. "That's it," Nathan said, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "The vanishing village." Thomas, the local guide, hesitated. "Something feels wrong. We should leave." But it was too late. The village had already chosen them. Edward, driven by his desire for history's secrets, was the first to approach the crumbling stone archway that marked the entrance. The others followed, reluctantly, until they stood in the village's central square. It was empty, but there was something unsettling about the stillness, a stillness that pressed in from all sides, as though the very air was holding its breath. Nathan pulled out his camera, snapping photos of the abandoned houses. His lens captured strange distortions in the frame, as though the village itself was refusing to be captured in its entirety. Lena wandered further into the village, her senses tingling, her instincts telling her to turn back, but she couldn't help herself. Something called to her from the shadows of a distant building. "Do you hear that?" she whispered to the group. A voice, a low, humming sound. Edward dismissed it, but Thomas, the guide, looked pale, his body rigid as he clutched his pack. "That's not a voice. That's something else." They all stood frozen, listening to the sound, now unmistakable, a rhythmic thudding, as though something, or someone, was pacing in the shadows, just out of sight. Then the first figure appeared. It wasn't a person, not quite. Its form was humanoid, but its limbs were elongated, too long for any normal human, and its eyes glowed, reflecting the faint light of the moon. It didn't speak, but it gestured, an unsettling, slow movement that seemed to beckon them deeper into the village. Edward stepped forward, his curiosity pushing him beyond reason. "We need to follow it," he said, voice trembling but determined. This is what we've come for." Lena grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Edward, no. This is wrong. We need to leave. Now." But it was already too late. The figure was gone, and in its place stood something far more sinister. A second figure had appeared, and then a third. More shadows, flickering, shifting, too fast for the human eye to follow. They surrounded the group, their glowing eyes reflecting something far darker than mere curiosity. A low hum filled the air, a pulse that seemed to come from within the village itself. The ground beneath them began to tremble as if the very earth itself was waking up, and the village was pulling them in, slowly, inevitably, into its grip. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, crept into their bones. Something was awakening. The temperature continued to drop, biting at their skin as a sickly green mist began to snake through the village. The ground felt soft, unstable, as though the earth beneath them had begun to shift. Edward's face was pale, but his eyes shone with the fever of discovery. "We have to press on," he insisted, voice trembling yet determined. "Whatever's here, it's ancient. This village, it's hiding something." Lena's fingers clenched around her flashlight, its beam cutting through the thick fog like a desperate lifeline. Her mind was screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to obey. Nathan, always the skeptic, had fallen silent, his camera now hanging from his neck, like an abandoned relic. Something in the air was suffocating the very thoughts from his mind, and he couldn't help but feel smaller, more insignificant. A soft scraping sound echoed from the distant building on the left, drawing their attention. The rhythmic scrape of something dragging across the stone. Slow, deliberate, unnerving. "That's it," Thomas whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave. This is no village. This is a prison." The buildings, once silent and still, began to creak and groan, their windows flickering with an unnatural cold light. At the edge of their vision, fleeting shadows darted between the houses, their forms humanoid but distorted, elongated like the ones they had seen earlier. The village was not abandoned. It was waiting for them. Then the hum they had first heard grew louder, rising into a full, terrifying chorus of distorted voices. The sound didn't come from anywhere in particular. It was as though it filled the very air around them, pressing in on their ears, crawling into their minds. A cacophony of whispers, half-formed words, incoherent cries that left them chilled to the bone. The voices were familiar, yet alien. They felt like they had heard them before. In their dreams, in their nightmares. Lena pressed her hand to her temple, feeling her mind fray. "I can't," she started, but the words caught in her throat. A piercing scream from Nathan cut her off, sending a wave of panic through the group. Nathan had been pulled toward one of the houses, his feet dragging through the dirt as though invisible hands gripped him. He fought to break free, his eyes wide with terror, but the force was too strong. "Help! Someone! Help!" His cries were swallowed by the whispering wind, and just as suddenly as it had started, the struggle stopped. Nathan's body went limp, his face frozen in sheer terror. They rushed toward him, but when they reached the spot where he had fallen, there was nothing. Not a trace. No body, no sign of struggle, just the faintest impression in the dirt, as if he had never existed. "We have to go," Thomas said urgently, his voice a mix of desperation and horror. "Whatever this is, it's not human. It's not even alive. It's something else." But Edward was already staring at the house, the one Nathan had been dragged toward. The doors were slightly ajar, as though inviting them in, promising answers in the form of something far worse. "Edward," Lena whispered, her voice shaking. "Please, let's go. It's too late for him." But Edward wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on the house, his face pale, yet his eyes were fevered with the thirst for knowledge. He took a single step forward, then another, dragging his unwilling companions with him. Each step was a battle, their minds screaming at them to turn around, to run, but their bodies obeyed only the call of the village. Inside, the walls were lined with ancient symbols, twisted sigils that pulsed with an eerie, unnatural glow. At the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, its surface covered in strange markings and blood-red stains. In the center of the pedestal, an object lay wrapped in ancient cloth, a relic from a time before time, its presence radiating an overwhelming sense of dread. "Do you see it?" Edward whispered, his voice distant. "It's here. This is what we were meant to find." But as he stepped closer to the pedestal, something shifted in the room. The very air grew thicker, heavier, and the whispers returned, now louder than ever. It was no longer just the wind. The voices were in their heads, urging them to look at the relic, to claim it. Lena grabbed Edward's arm, trying to pull him back, but he resisted, his eyes glassy, as if in a trance. "We're so close," he muttered, reaching out toward the relic. Then a low growl rumbled from the shadows, a sound that resonated deep within their bones. The room seemed to pulse, and the relic began to glow, its light growing brighter and more malevolent by the second. And that was when they realized they had made a terrible mistake. Whatever it was that had vanished the village's inhabitants, whatever ancient horror had been locked away for centuries, it was waking up, and it was not going to let them leave. The glow from the pedestal intensified, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced across the walls, twisting like living things. The air crackled with an oppressive energy, the whispers now a deafening roar in their ears, each voice blending into the next in a cacophony of madness. Edward reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the edge of the cloth. But before he could touch the relic, a hideous screech filled the room, and the air itself seemed to buckle under the weight of the sound. The ground beneath them cracked open with a deafening rattle, a deep, gaping fissure swallowing the floor. A monstrous form began to emerge from the shadows, an unnatural silhouette, jagged and shifting. It had no true shape, only flashes of limbs, eyes and teeth, all twisted into an abominable blend of nightmare and reality. Lena staggered back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Edward, stop. You don't know what you're doing." But it was too late. The village had awoken, and it had found them. A chill unlike anything they had felt before swept over them, sinking into their bones, numbing their very souls. The shadows swelled, coiling around their legs, dragging them toward the center of the room. The voices grew louder, more urgent, whispers, but also growls and cries, blending into an incoherent symphony of terror. Edward's eyes widened as he looked back at them, his pupils dilated in a trance-like state, but the look on his face was not one of triumph. It was one of horror. He could feel the evil, the terror that had been lying dormant for centuries, and now it was alive, pulling at his very being. But the relic called to him. His hand hovered over it, the last vestige of humanity he had clinging to the instinct to run. But curiosity, and something darker, pushed him onward. He could not resist. As his fingers brushed the surface of the relic, the ground beneath them gave way entirely. The stone beneath them cracked wide open, and the room plunged into darkness. In that moment, the world ceased to make sense. Time twisted, and reality itself seemed to unravel. The shadows reached out, lashing and writhing like serpents. The entity that had been lurking in the dark began to manifest in full, its grotesque form revealed. An endless void of twisted faces, arms, and legs, all contorted into a ghastly amalgamation of terror and death. It lunged toward Edward, its hands, if they could be called that, gripping him, pulling him toward the abyss that had opened beneath them. His screams echoed through the dark, but they were swallowed by the sound of the earth tearing apart. Lena tried to move, to help, but her body refused to obey her. She felt herself being dragged away, pulled into the very maw of the horror they had unleashed. The last thing she saw was Edward's face, a twisted mask of agony, before he was consumed by the darkness, his body vanishing into the pit without a trace. The village shook as if in mourning, the entity's scream of triumph reverberating throughout the air. Lena, still frozen in terror, could do nothing but watch in horror as the very ground beneath them began to collapse, crumbling into the void. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The room was still. The air was thick with the heavy scent of decay. The pedestal, and the relic that had begun it all, lay in ruins. The village had returned to its forgotten state, the whispers fading into silence. Lena was alone. Lena was the last of them, standing on the edge of a void that had once been the village, her mind shattered by the horrors she had witnessed. The village had taken everything, her friends, her sanity, and perhaps her very soul. But the terror didn't end there. As she turned to leave, she felt it, a presence lingering just beyond her reach, watching her, waiting for the moment when she would slip up, when the curse would claim her as it had claimed so many others before. The truth was simple, and yet impossible to ignore. The Vanishing Village was not just a place. It was a curse, a living, breathing nightmare, and it had always been watching. And now it was waiting for its next victim.